sjá hvað það margir sem þekkja þennan viðburð okkar árlega. Og það mjög samkvæmlega ánægja að bjóða ykkur öll velkomin á Hugvísindaþingið 2024. Hugvísindaþing var fyrst haldið árið 1996 og hefur verið árviss viðburður síðan 1999, ef undan skilið COVID árið 2021. Og þingið hefur opið öllu áhugafólki málefni hugvísinda og hefur ætíð verið mjög vel sótt, eins og við sjáum bara hér, bæði af hugvísindafólki, fólki af öðrum fræðasviðum og svo öllum almenningi. Málstofum fjölgar frá ári til árs og þær eru í ár 43 og erindin á þinginu tæplega 155. Að vanda viðfangsefnin í ár fjölbreytt og spennandi og eins og sjá má á kynningarsíðu þingsins þá verður meðal annars fjallað femíníska siðfræði í Barbie, goð og hetjur, strumpa og skordýramál, sögulega rætur kynþáttahyggju, brennivínslandið Ísland, kennsluþróun í hugvísindum, íslenskar kvikmyndir, máltækni, sögn og fyrirlestur. Mörg hafa lagt hönd á plóg skipulagningu þingsins og eiga þau öll þakkir skildar. Margrét Guðmundsdóttir, sem nú rekstrarstjóri rannsóknarþjónustu á hugvísindasviði, hefur lagt vel og vandað skipulagningu þingsins árabil en ákvaða þessu sinni að stíga til hliðar. Þótt grunninn og reyndar hún hefði meira ákoma á þinginu heldur hún vill sjálf viðurkenna. En ég vil allan nota tækifæri hérna og þakkjunni fyrir frábært starf á þessum vettvangi á undanförnum árum. En það kemur náttúrulega maður í manns stað að þessi sinni tók Dagbjörg Guðmundsdóttir, sem þarna stendur við keflinu. Dagbjörg hefur enda komið áður að skipulagningu þingsins með Margréti, en hún hefur lagt stund á doktorsnámi í íslensku eins og margir vita hérna og vinnur þessar myndir á skrifstofu sviðsins. Hún hefur sem borið með ábyrgð á skipulagningu þingsins með aðstoð annarra starfsmanna á skrifstofu sviðsins. Og að öðrum ólöstuðum og þá ástæði til að þakka Guðmundi Herði Guðmundsssyni kynningarstjóra fyrir hans framlag í þágu þingsins, því að það var ómetanlegt. Málstofurnar verða í 4 húsum í Veröld sem hérna fyrir sunnan Eddu, í Árnagarði, Odda og Lögbergi sem byggingarnar fyrir sunnan aðalbyggingu háskólans. Og síðan verður kaffi á Litlatorgi sem inn af hámu, sem kalla þetta rými Litluhámu. Móttakari og þingsins verður svo aftur hérna í Eddu á jarðhæðinni hérna fyrir framan. Það hefur verið hefð fyrir því frá upphafi að opna Hugvísindaþing með hátíðarfyrirlestri og að þessu sinni vorum við svo heppin að fá hana Carolyne Larrington til liðs við okkur. Carolyne prófessor emerita í evrópskum miðaldabókmenntum við Oxford-háskóla og emerita og rannsóknarfélagi við St. John's College í Oxford. Hún okkur hugvísindafólki á Íslandi að góðu kunn, hefur starfað náið með mörgum íslenskum fræðimönnum nú nýlega í stóru rannsóknarverkefni með Sérsvið Carolyne í verkefni sem heitir Emotions, Erindi og South. Helstu Sérsvið Carolyne eru norrænar og evrópskar miðaldabókmenntir, sérmjók og ekki síður nútímaaðlaganir á miðaldaefni. Það nútímaútfærslur á fornbókmenntum. Hér fáum við að heyra nánar af þeim þætti rannsóknar Carolyne í erindi sem hún nefnir Old Norse Myth in Anglophone Popular Culture, Óðinn, Þórr and Loki and His Children. Carolyne, it's a pleasure to have you here with us.
Thank you very much.
Welcome. Thank you.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. It's a great honor to come to speak to this conference. I'm only 4 years late. I was supposed to be here in 2020, but finally I've made it, and now I have a completely different talk to give as well from the one that I was going to do 4 years ago. So what I want to do in this lecture is to examine the ways in which 3 principal figures of Old Norse myth have been made to signify in recent Anglo-American culture with a bit of Norwegian culture on the side. I'll be exploring the figures of Óðinn, Þórr and Loki and his monstrous children in novels, films, TV shows and operas. And I'm going to argue that these figures are indeed, as journalists like to say, having a moment in the present day popular imagination. And they're having a moment in ways that differ considerably from their roles in previous 19th and early 20th century works. The cultural functions that they fulfill are still closely related to their depictions in medieval sources, and indeed the authenticity of these depictions in relation to edict material, for example, is a subject of very lively debate in fan communities. But these characters, as we'll see, are also fundamentally retooled and reimagined in order to reflect on some key contemporary concepts. So I'm going to start with Óðinn. And although I've said I want to talk about Óðinn in the 21st century, when it comes to Óðinn, we always have to reckon with Wagner. And here we have Wotan on his horse Sleipnir, as depicted by Arthur Rackham for the libretto of the Ring cycle when it was translated into English in 1910. And then we have Bryntevel as Wotan in Das Rheingold in the New York Met in 2010. And I know that Ásdís Egilsdóttir, who is here, went to see that production and tipped me off, so I went to see it as well, very happily. So Wagner's depiction of the god in Der Ring des Nibelungen has both popularized and definitively shaped the figure as we find him in the modern day. In contrast to the god in the myths, who's still pretty active, even if one of his epithets is the old one, we find that Óðinn of the myths is wandering the world in search of wisdom, he's fathering children, he's stealing the mead of poetry, and he fully intends to go down fighting against the wolf at Ragnarök. And at the beginning of Das Rheingold, this is the Wotan that we see. He's at the zenith of his powers. And indeed, in the recent production of The Ring at the Royal Opera House, he and his family were a bunch of oligarchs, all having a lovely time. And with Loga as a slightly difficult henchman. But that's as good as it gets for Wotan in The Ring. He spends the rest of his time trying to find ways of getting hold of the ring, trying to avert Alberich's bid for power, trying to father the right kind of hero, and failing miserably. And so by the end of the cycle, in Götterdämmerung, we don't see him at all. The doom of the gods is upon him. The branches of Yggdrasil are all piled up against Valhalla, that expensive acquisition that cost so much at the beginning of the cycle. And it's all ready to catch fire at the end. The rule of the gods is over, and by the time the Rhine rises and Brunhilde casts herself onto the funeral pyre, it's time for men and women to rule themselves without gods of any kind. So this idea then of Óðinn as superannuated, as a representative of a patriarchal order that's losing power, and which is desperately trying to find ways of holding on to what it has, is important for the contemporary versions of Óðinn. So what we have here is Sir Anthony Hopkins as Óðinn, I should say, in the Marvel Comic Universe Thor movie from 2011, and then Ian McShane's Mr. Wednesday in the Starz TV show American Gods, based on Neil Gaiman's novel American Gods from 2001. So in the Marvel Comic Universe, Óðinn has a long and heroic backstory of conquest, which I'll come on to a bit later. But the Thor movies actually begin when Óðinn, Anthony Hopkins, has had enough, effectively deciding he wants to retire and hand over his kingship in Asgard, or Asgarda, to his son Thor. But it turns out Thor is manifestly not ready for this responsibility. He responds to an incursion by the frost giants with a punitive expedition, and he's sent off to Earth to grow up. Odinn doesn't have much to do in the second movie, partly because it's all set on Earth, in London, strangely enough. And he dies quite early in the third movie. And at one point between movie 2 and movie 3, Loki casts a spell over his adoptive father and sends him off to the Shady Acres care home in New York, from which he escapes, he wanders around the world, and he returns to die in Norway. So in contrast to poor old Odin in this universe, in American Gods, the Odin figure, Mr. Wednesday, is still a key protagonist. He's the leader of the old gods who arrived in North America, along with the migrants who formerly believed in them. And so the setup for Gaiman's novel is that as each wave of migration comes to America, they bring their gods with them. And this is complicated by the fact that Leif Erikson, of course, was a Christian, so he couldn't really have Odin in his ship. So Gaiman imagines there was an earlier Norse expedition to America, and so when Leifr and the gang get there, Odin is already there. And we also have Egyptian gods, Indian gods, ancient Near Eastern gods, and so on. And not actually all that many Greek gods, for reasons I'm not quite sure about. So Wednesday has been in America since the 9th century. And the old gods in the novel are opposed by the new gods. Figures such as Media, Mr. World, who turns out to be Loki in disguise, but that's another story. Technical Boy, and the gods of the automobile, and the gods of aeroplanes. Wednesday resents his loss of worshippers and the diminution of his powers, and throughout the novel he's a kind of con man or a grifter. He has a complicated scheme to recover his waning strength, and Shadow Moon, the hero of the novel, plays the role of Baldur, as well as in part doubling Odin himself. And Shadow takes a long time to figure out who his patron is, and finally by about page 300 he's saying, Odin? But the smart reader has figured it out already. Mr. Wednesday is working to bring about a great battle, akin to Ragnarok, between all the old gods and the new in order to restore his lost powers. It's a scheme that Shadow thwarts, but not before suffering Baldur's fate, going down into the world of the dead, and hanging himself on the world tree for 9 days and 9 nights. And the final Odin figure I want to consider here is from George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire and the TV show Game of Thrones. And here it's clear that George Martin has been thinking about Odin's sacrifice of himself to himself, hanging on Yggdrasil, as we learn about in Hávamál, in order to gain the knowledge of the runes. And in the books, and indeed the show, the young Bran Stark, who has lost the use of his legs, is summoned by a mysterious figure who appears to him in his dreams in the shape of a bird. And in the books, this is the three-eyed crow, which I think we can all agree is wrong. In the show, it's the three-eyed raven, which is much, much better, much more Odinic, clearly echoing Hugin and Munin. And when we finally meet the human version of the three-eyed raven, he's deep in a cave beneath the haunted forest. And that's this guy here. And he has long flowing white hair, he's missing an eye. In the TV show he wasn't, but in the books he is. And he's quite old and immobile, and he's on a throne made of wood, and the tree roots from the forest are penetrating through his body, and they're growing out of his empty eye socket. You can see why they didn't show that on TV. Through this branching root system, the seer remains in touch with all the sacred groves of the north, and he can see past, present, and future through the tree's mystical powers and interconnectedness. This is a very different side of Odin from the anxious, scheming patriarch in the other versions I've talked about. But in the TV show, at least, I don't know what's going to happen in the books if they're ever finished, the three-eyed raven is just as helpless as all the other modern Odins when it comes to trying to avoid the fate that he can foresee, and indeed like the Odin of the myths. So for the Marvel writers, Odin lingers as a relic from a time before men turned irrevocably to new gods, or before he grew too tired and his powers became attenuated. He now speaks to a patriarchal order that's played out, to a model of heroic masculinity combined with a kind of political pragmatism that no longer convinces. Odin's generation no longer matters, and so he's often found fighting an uncompromising rearguard action against a future that holds no place for him, as in Gaiman's American Gods. Now let's turn to Thor. This is more cheerful. So, the Thor of the myth is mostly spending his time bashing giants with Mjolnir. Not appearing all that clever, he's outwitted by Old Loki, but clearly there must have been more to Thor than that. Thor is the antagonist of Christ at the conversion. Thor is the person or the god whose name is encoded in so many personal names, and Thor is the one who guides settlers to their new homes in Iceland. So Thor must have been much more important. Not to Wagner, however, who barely gives him a part at all, except wandering around shouting for a bit. But Thor's modern fortunes took an unexpected turn in 1962, when Jack Kirby, Stan Lee, and Larry Lieber decided to introduce an all-new character, the Mighty Thor, in an original series for Marvel Comics. Lee had the idea of making the hero a god rather than a normal superhero, if you have normal superheroes, because he came with all this great stuff. And he says, I pictured Norse gods looking like Vikings of old with the flowing beards. Slightly absent, actually. There's a bit of stubble there, maybe. But with the flowing beards, the horned helmets, and battle clubs, which doesn't strike me as well anyway. That's what Lee said in 2002. And in the Marvel Comics version, Thor finds affinity with humans when Odin banishes him to Earth in order to learn humility. He loses his memory of being a god, he's partly disabled, and he's a medical student called Donald Blake, and he's also mortal. But on holiday in Norway, he wanders into a cave where he finds Mjolnir, disguised as a walking stick. He strikes it against a rock and reactivates his divine identity. And Mjolnir not only allows him to determine the weather all across the globe, so we know who to blame, I think, it also enables him to fly, which all superheroes have to be able to do. And of course, it fulfills its original function as an invincible weapon. So this comic book, Thor, also becomes a member of the Avengers, a team of superheroes including the Incredible Hulk and Iron Man. And over the years, he's lost body parts and replaced them with prostheses. He's been deprived of Mjolnir and had to harness mighty resources to get the dwarves to forge a replacement. In the comic universe, it's having Mjolnir that confers the state of being Thor on the person who wields the weapon. So in a 2014 storyline, we had a female Thor, and this, I think, turned up in the last Thor movie as well. Self-doubt, feelings of unworthiness and guilt about his past actions shape up the superhero's idea of himself, and he has a huge crisis of confidence, questioning his very identity in person. He's no longer the mighty Thor, but the unworthy Thor. And this development produces a profoundly psychological reading of what it means to be a god or a confident, mature human being in the comics. There have been 4 Thor movies, from Thor 2011 to Thor Love and Thunder in 2022. And the movie Thor shares many of the Norse god's characteristics. He's strong, he's not particularly thoughtful, at least at first, and he dedicates himself once on Earth to protecting mankind against the monsters unleashed by his enemies. So he's always a courageous fighter. He's temporarily wrong-footed when he's separated from Mjolnir, but he's not completely powerless. In Thor Ragnarok, his sister Hela, the goddess of death, suddenly turns up, and in the first maybe 15 minutes destroys Mjolnir, which is a surprise. And Thor has to learn that he can cope without this magical prop. And Odin says to him at the film's climax, that hammer helped you control your power, to focus it, but it was never the source of your strength, because Thor seems actually to be able to call upon his Ausmeyen, his divine powers, if he just concentrates hard enough. Now, in young adult literature and in the Netflix series Ragnarok, the idea of Thor as not very clever, easily fooled, and mostly interested in violence persists across these literary treatments. The British writer Joanne Harris has a version of Loki who narrates the Gospel of Loki from 2014. Admittedly, Loki's perspective is a very partial one. And Loki calls Thor, quote, a muscle-bound oaf with more beard than brain, and a love of sports and hitting things. And that Thor is treated as somewhat stupid and violent limits the roles he can play in a number of modern retellings. The most popular of his mythic adventures is undoubtedly the tale from Thrymsquiver, which I'm sure you all know, in which Mjolnir is stolen and can only be retrieved if Freyja will agree to marry the giant Thrymur. And I'm sure, as you all know, Freyja refuses, rather forcefully. And so the gods dress a heavily veiled Thor as a bride and send him off to Jotunheimar with Loki to do the talking. And Mjolnir is recovered and the Jötnar are destroyed. In Francesca Simon's The Lost Gods from 2013, Óðinn, Thor and Freyja arrive in London. They're looking for a little girl who, confusingly, is also called Freyja, who was their ally in the previous book in the series, The Sleeping Army from 2011. The gods are seeking to expand and renew their worship among their followers. It has to be said that in Simon's universe, the Norse religion is practiced in Britain. So it's as if the Vikings managed to retain hold over Britain instead of the Norman conquest happening. So the official religion in this England is a kind of Oddinism, I guess. So it's a good idea for the gods to turn up in London and try to build up their followers. Thor is huge and red-bearded, and he lashes out with his hammer every time he's puzzled by the modern world. And the first casualty is Freyja's mobile phone, which looks like terrible magic. And the little girl Freyja is watching TV, and she has a wonderful insight. The gods didn't need worshippers, they needed fans. And so the gods go on to achieve all the success you could hope for in celebrity culture. Thor is signed to play football for Tottenham Hotspur and becomes the greatest footballer ever to play in the Premier League. Now, I said to Francesca Simon that she had missed the trick here. He should have been playing for West Ham, whose followers are called the Hammers. But Francesca admitted she didn't know anything about football. So. And the god really loves his new career. He said, I love this game. It's even more fun than bashing giants. That much fun. And soon he's promoting his own Lightning Bolt branded tracksuit range. Freyja becomes a fashion model, and Óðinn, who is a great success on Twitter, as you might expect, dazzles in the TV talent show because he can compose and recite poetry on any subject. I'm a bit surprised people were enthusiastic about this. So the fans' adulation restores the god's power. And although the frost giants, of course, turn up advancing both on Ausgarðr and Midgarðr, their defeat depends, as so often, on Thor dressing up as the bride in order to lure all the enemies to Thrym's wedding and then destroying them. Now, in the popular Norwegian Netflix show Ragnarok from 2020 to 23, we have the story of Magna, who is a boy who returns with his mother and brother to his Norwegian hometown of Eddu. His father died before the family left Eddu the first time around. And Magna is the new boy in school. He's struggling with dyslexia, he's finding it hard to make friends, but his life changes when he discovers that he is really Thor. And he does this by picking up his father's sledgehammer, which you can see him wielding. It's a really big sledgehammer, but anyway. So it turns out his brother Lauritz is dealing with issues around coming out and finding his own sexual identity, and he is actually Loki. And the Jötl family are a bunch of industrialists who run the town. Their chemical works is polluting the fjord and all the water sources. And Þór assembles a band of allies, a wise one-eyed man in a wheelchair, a very beautiful fellow student of South Asian heritage, a sports coach who loses one hand in an accident, and a prophetic cashier at the local supermarket who is called Vinka, who is as close to Virva, I think, as you can get. The show combines high school drama with mythological references and environmental concerns to great effect. Magna, Þór, learns confidence, how to use his strength. He learns the value of compromise. Lauritz finds happiness in a steady relationship. And the show ends as Magna graduates, ready to step into a new adult identity, one that's shaped by his identification with the god and his projection of divine and mutant features onto the rest of the community. I'm trying not to give you any spoilers here. So Þór has quite a lot of work to do in the contemporary world. The enemies against whom he's pitched in the Marvel comic universe represent terrifying forces. And this Marvel Þór has a strangely protean identity. He doesn't have to be the son of Óðinn, he doesn't even have to be male. He doesn't require mjölnir, but he can simply call upon his divine power, his self-belief and his confidence to overcome all obstacles. And this strikes me as a profoundly American way of framing this figure. We can all be Þór if we just believe. Elsewhere, Þór provides comic relief in these constant power struggles between Óðinn and Loki and the Jötnar. And in Ragnarok, Magna's discovery of himself as Þór charts his growth into manhood, allowing him to learn how to balance force and negotiation, how to live with his disabilities and how to make friends and keep them. And he changes the community within which he lives for the good. So Þór, I suggest, is still in the process of working through the tensions in modern masculinity. Now, next we have Loki. When I was young, many, many years ago, Loki was bad. In all the retellings I read when I was 7 or 8, he was a trickster. Yes, he was quite funny, but he was pretty evil, and we all knew that. But his fortunes have taken, for me, a rather unexpected turn in the last 40 years. Everybody loves Loki now. He is initially likeable in his trickster form, and this foreshadows the many ways in which he's been rehabilitated in treatments from this century. He has a questing intelligence, he has easy charm, he's sexually attractive, and he has a relaxed view of ethical questions, which turns him into a favourite anti-hero. So in contrast with Óðinn or Þór, Loki has come out really well in recent versions of his story. The British writer A.S. Byatt, who's just died, likes him very much indeed, both now, or in 2011 when she was writing her book, and when she was a child. And in her short novel Ragnarok from 2011, she meditates on her reading of the Norse myths in her childhood in World War II. And there Byatt writes, "Alone among all these beings, that is all the Norse gods, he had humour and wit. His changeable shapes were attractive, his cleverness had charm. He made her uneasy, but she had feelings about him." And indeed, Byatt shows Loki as the intellectual's god. So we should maybe all think about that today. He's the one who's wondering, who is speculating, he's thinking, he's endlessly poking at parts of the universe to see what will happen. And in Byatt's novel, Loki says to his daughter, the Midgardsormr, "The other gods hammer and slash. They do not study. I study. I know." And it's that knowingness that fuels Byatt's lasting sympathy with Loki. Even when he deliberately brings about the death of Baldur, he is at least the god who sets narratives in motion. Joanne Harris's The Gospel of Loki from 2014 filters the history of the gods through Loki's consciousness, as I mentioned earlier, offering a defiant, often very camp, running commentary on the grave matters of gods and men. At the beginning, Loki is summoned by Óðinn out of chaos, where he took the form of wildfire, thanks partly to Wagner and thanks to Jakob Grimm, I think. And Loki finds himself among the Aesir, but he will never quite belong. He's clearly smarter than everybody else around him and considerably more annoying, I think. Óðinn is his brother, but also increasingly an authority that annoys Loki, and his mischief becomes more destructive. As time goes on, he becomes increasingly alienated from the other gods, and the fate of his children, the monstrous ones, bound and exiled, distresses him more than you might expect for a fairly comic figure. After Fenrir is bound, he begins to wonder how long it will be before the gods find an excuse to chain him up as well. And thus a vicious feedback loop of dislike and mistrust is set up, leading ultimately to the events that bring about Ragnarök. The Marvel movie Loki, played by Tom Hiddleston, is enmeshed in a recurrent family drama. And I think this may be because Kenneth Branagh, the distinguished Shakespearean actor and director, directed the first movie. Hiddleston, or Loki, is the adoptive son who doesn't quite belong. He's the favourite of neither of his parents. He feels himself caught between conflicting identities and loyalties. His storylines recycle a pattern of persuading others, mostly Thor, to trust him, betraying that trust and gaining contemporary advantage. And yet, when the stakes are at their highest, he will still fight for Asgard and the survival of its people. He dies, or he appears to die many times, yet somehow he still survives, still working at his conflicted relationship with his brother. He's betrayed and murdered his real father, Loki, who's obviously really his mother, but never mind. And he's always ready to leave Thor in the lurch. But in Thor Ragnarok, he saves the day by unleashing Surtur, the fire demon, and setting him against Hela, the goddess of death, who is pretty difficult to kill, as you can imagine. Asgard goes up in flames, but the Asgardians at least manage to escape from their doomed planet. And Loki has also become a queer icon. His sexuality is polymorphous, and his nature demands frequent transformation and reinvention. He shifted shape as he shifted sex. He was slippery, noted A.S. Byatt. And in the Disney TV spin-off show, which premiered in June 2022, Loki finds himself in a multiverse, a concept borrowed from quantum physics, which suggests that you have multiple universes existing in parallel. Thus, Loki has multiple avatars who unpack the different possibilities inherent in Loki's character. In particular, or so the publicity claimed, a Loki who is gender fluid. But in fact, I think he turned out to be not that gender fluid, and the queerest version of him we had was when he became a CGI crocodile. Fair enough, yeah. Loki's anti-hero status, particularly as characterized against Thor's brand of traditional masculinity, has generated an enthusiastic fandom who are deeply interested in gender identity and sexual difference, but the TV show hasn't really delivered on that. Lauritz, however, in the Netflix show, this is Lauritz when he sees himself in a mirror which reveals the true divine nature of the character. And so this is Lauritz as Loki himself, wearing a lot of eyeliner, but he does that when he's being human as well. And Lauritz's story is one of shifting loyalties too. He loves his brother and his mother, but he also is dazzled by the Jötull family, and he goes backwards and forwards between them. He's a very funny kid, but he's the weird kid in school. And once he finds a nice boy to settle down with, then things get a little bit easier for him. So the modern Loki then is a flawed anti-hero, amoral and witty, shrewd and yet somehow not beyond redemption. His outsider status and his alienation from the gods, particularly Óðinn's priorities, and his determination to act as he pleases, to inquire, to experiment, recasts him as the surrogate for the novelist who seeks to inquire into the imaginative world of the gods. He's the catalyst for the best stories and the most modern of deities. At the same time, he possesses many of the attributes of the classic American heroes. He's the wisecracking lone wolf who answers to no one and who sets out to shape his own destiny for good and for ill. Well, let's take a quick look at Loki's children now, Fenrir, the Midgardsormr, and Hel, who all figure in contemporary fantasy. But perhaps unsurprisingly, it's Hel whose part human form makes her easier to incorporate into superhuman and young adult narratives. The servant is kind of expensive CGI and not very nice. Joanne Harris makes Fenrir into a werewolf. At first, he's a cute little werewolf when he lives among the gods. But then he grows up into an objectionable adolescent. He's hairy, he's smelly, he growls a lot, and he eats too much. So the gods decide to chain him up. They're aware of the prophecy, of course, that he will kill Óðinn, but also perhaps their action serves to make that prophecy come true. As I said before, this is a move that further alienates Loki from the divine cohort. In A.S. Byatt's account of Ragnarok, Jörmungandr, the Midgard serpent, is female. She's eternally hungry, and although we have a beautiful undersea environment when the world is created, the Midgardsormr hoovers her way through the marine environment, eating the fish and the plants and the animals, powerfully figuring contemporary degradation of the sea and its underwater environment. She becomes increasingly bad-tempered, particularly after Thor hits her on the head with a hammer. Hela, played here by Kate Blanchett, appears in Thor Ragnarok. As I mentioned, she's released from confinement after the death of Óðinn. She immediately destroys Mjolnir and she marches back into Asgard. And this is where we find out that Hela and Óðinn between them were the ones who conquered the 9 realms back in the day, father and daughter. And Hela takes a look at the many murals that Óðinn has had depicting the conquest of the 9 realms. Óðinn and I drowned entire civilizations in blood and tears, she boasts. But when she sees the murals, the story of her father's victory, she's been edited out. They tell a different tale. And she snarls, "Has no one been taught our history? Look at these lies. Goblets and garden parties, peace treaties." And history and its narratives, who gets to write them, which truths are promoted and suppressed, is one of the film's major themes, and I think one of the most interesting points in it. Well, Loki's children also appear in the Ragnarok show and in Francesca Simon and Gavin Higgins' chamber opera from 2019, The Monstrous Child. And The Monstrous Child is based on Francesca's book of the same name. Hel in this story is a teenager with a disability. Her lower half is like a massive seaweed, which you can kind of see there. She can't move, and it's just a kind of clump of decaying matter. So the gods don't like the look of her, and they send her down into the world of the dead. By this time, she's a pretty, anxious teenager with wonderful blue hair, as you can see. Her upper half protruding from this mass from which she can't escape. And Hel, like any teenage girl, is distraught when she finds herself exiled from the sun and the sky and the grass, consigned to a dark realm full of very unhappy dead people. And she misses Baldur in particular, who has always been kind to her, of course, and with whom she is in love. So when he finally arrives in her kingdom, in the opera it's she and not Loki who refuses to weep for him. The monstrous children partly figure in the Netflix Ragnarok as well. There's a large wolfhound who's confusingly called Thrym, who attacks Magna and Thor, and there isn't any Hel, but the field does contain a monster serpent, in fact a tapeworm, which had to be removed from Lauritz, which is why Lauritz gave birth to him, and which he kept in a tank in his room, and he threw it in the field. He continues to feed it and calls it to him with "come to mama," which is weird and strange. And there is a version of Thor's fishing expedition in season 3. So the monstrous children represent, as they always have, various concepts. Fenrir, perhaps the concept of the forces of time. The Midgardsormr, the limitations of space, and Hel, of course, representing death. Well, it's all still going on. Contemporary engagement with Norse myth continues. Melvyn Burgess, just like everybody, had to write a novel from the point of view of Loki, which came out in 2022, which I haven't read, so I can't report on. You will remember Jay Angeli, the so-called capital shaman with his tattoos of the Valknutur, Yggdrasil and Thor's hammer, happily, or maybe not so happily, anyway, out of prison now. And Robert Eggers' film The Northman from 2022, with a script co-written by Sion, has much that's mythic in it, but I can see that Terry Gunnell is watching me to see what I'm going to say about this. It has Valkyries, it has the cults of Freyr and Óðinn, it has initiation rituals, sailor prophecies, so much more. So the Norse gods are indeed having a moment, but it's a decades-long moment. Why? Well, I have various ideas about this. Partly because they're our gods, and by that I mean the gods of the Northern Europeans, including us British with our own part Scandinavian heritage. And thanks to the traditions of Eirik saga and Grænlendinga saga and Neil Gaiman's vision, but of course already an idea that was existing before in American culture, they are imagined as, in a sense, American gods as well. The gods of the white Scandinavian or even the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants of America. They offer an alternative to the Greek and Roman gods, whose tales are very well known and often associated with the cultural elite who've studied the classics. These gods are more down to earth. They're more like us, perhaps, and certainly less Olympian. And because of their northernness, their patriarchal nature, at least in tradition, and their whiteness, along with offering the possibility of claiming Scandinavians as the first Americans to arrive on the continent, the gods of Norse myth, in particular Óðinn and Þórr, have been claimed by far-right white supremacists as validating their racist and patriarchal beliefs. But this is something which absolutely must be resisted. These are not these people's myths. Thinking about and thinking with the myths has always been contingent and historically specific. The stories have been made to mean differently over the centuries, serving the needs and fueling the aspirations of particular societies and cultural groups. The myths are supple, strange, radically different, and yet they engage, as I hope I've shown, with much larger questions than the limited and self-serving obsessions of far-right politics and conspiracy theorists. The reformulations of Óðinn's story enable us to think critically about the inevitable end of the old order and the emergence of the new. The Þór cycle illuminates some of the changing ways in which we think about masculinity, both its advantages and its drawbacks, how to balance aggression and tenderness. Loki and His Children allow us to explore paradoxes of both and gender and queerness, and questions about time, space and mortality, the climate crisis, death and its place in life, and who gets to claim the stories of the gods for posterity. Oh, wait a minute, that's an old slide that should not be there. You thought I was going to unleash Ragnarok.
Presentation. I bet there are some questions in the room. Reflections?
No?
Yes?
The person who only caught the last 10 minutes of it, I apologize. But you sort of people writing novels about Loki and such. Is this the same far right as takes Óðinn and Þór? I would assume these would be totally different people.
I think Loki doesn't appeal to the far right because he's too queer.
Okay.
Too strange, too weird. So no, what I was saying about Loki, which you missed in essence, was writers love Loki. Everybody loves Loki, but writers love him because he's the one with brains. He thinks, he studies, he figures things out. And he also makes things happen, which is what authors like. Something has to drive the narrative forward. Otherwise, everybody's just sitting in Balhurt forever, drinking, waiting for Fenrir to show up. But Loki gets things to happen. He makes so many of those myths which have survived. He's the one who's the driving force.
Yes. Thank you. More questions? Yes, back there.
So, sorry if this is a silly question, but it seems like you talked really well about the way that modern culture adapts, has adapted these myths as cultures change, so have they. And then I see your book says the way that myths shape the way that we think. So I was wondering, in what way have they actually, changed the way we think, rather than been shaped by us?
Yeah, well, full disclosure here is, of course, that this book is part of the series, the Greek and Roman myths which shape the way we think, and they really do, I think. The Celtic myths that shape the way we think, which they really don't. and the Old Norse myths that shape the way we think, kind of. And what I argue in different parts of the book is that, particularly thinking about Ragnarok, that really has shaped the way we think about the contemporary tribe. But also people are taking these figures. Why take Odin? Why take Thor? Why take Loki? And use them instead of just inventing new characters. So there's something about the collective tradition behind these characters which is useful. And you can either work with it or you can subvert it in some ways. So I think, and actually in comparison to when I was young again, decades and decades ago, when I go and talk to kids in schools, I say, what do you know about Thor? And, oh, I know, he doesn't wear a horned helmet, he has this hammer, he has these mighty powers, he sometimes dresses up as a woman in this story. They know so much now. So I think they are doing cultural work, which is shaping the way we think, not in a big metaphysical sense, but as a really important part of our cultural reference.
So a number of the contemporary sources that you brought out today are by female authors. So I wonder to what degree we can see that the myths are evolving due to that feminine perspective. The narrative is shifting as a result of sort of feminist literary criticism and things of this. This is a new area that's open to feminine voices that might not have been heard 40, 50, 100, 200, 1,000 years ago.
Yeah, this is International Women's Day, of course. So I think this at one point my section on Loki was entitled "All the Ladies Love Loki," and then I thought, no, everybody loves Loki actually. But women do particularly like him, and I think it's because thinking with Loki, retelling the tales in Loki's voice, allows female authors in particular to push back against the set narratives we have from Snorri, which are, as Margaret Clunies-Ross says, these are very Aesir-centric stories. You can almost imagine Óðinn getting somebody in and saying, right, write this down, this is how it all happened, this is why I had to do some of those things I had to do. And Loki, everybody is really interested in him because he's this anti-hero, and because he takes part in so many stories you can then retell as part of the plot. Genevieve Gornichek, who I didn't have time to talk about, wrote a novel called The Witch's Heart, which is about Anglophone, Loki's partner, and the mother of the monstrous children. And it's a great retelling, very much from a different point of view. But because she's a witch living in Jarnfjörður, she's not in Asgard, she's not in Valhalla. So for a lot of the time, she's kind of sitting there going, where is Dad? And Loki is a kind of deadbeat dad who turns up from time to time. And then he tells her all these stories. Oh yeah, this thing happened, I had to change into an eagle. I kidnapped Ethan, no, what was I thinking? But by the end of it, because your sympathies are with the monstrous children, difficult though they are, by the time Ragnarok is coming and Anglophone has given up on Loki, kind of, and she's in a relationship with Skadi. When the Jötnar march on Valhalla, going, yeah, go Jötnar. because the gods have turned out to be so corrupt. And this idea that Loki is justified in his hostility because of the treatment of the children is one that's really very prevalent in these stories. And I think that's a point of view that reflects ideas about maternity.
Yes, there was, I think, there was one more question back there, maybe. Yes, thank you.
I've noticed that a major through line in the adaptations, but it's also kind of something unique about the Norse myths, like the original Norse myth material itself is the disability themes.
Yeah.
Is there a reason that, do you think there's a reason that they've become so prominent in the adaptations especially? Or is it just like we've become more comfortable thinking about it in the same way we've been more comfortable like exploring queer themes?
I think it's exactly that in a sense. I think that the Norse myths, for better or for worse, have become kind of part of or adjacent to the huge genre of fantasy. And fantasy increasingly in this century has become more inclusive, more diverse. And so people are casting around for characters who are just not white boy heroes like Harry Potter. I mean, with a big scar. Harry is fairly advantaged in some senses. And so people are looking out for these disabled figures. In particular, I think Gornicek is very interested in hell, like Francesca Simon is. I mean, it is difficult to be sympathetic towards the Midgard Sauna, to be fair. Not very domestic, and she spits a lot. It's difficult. Yeah, so I think it is part of that. I think it's part of a move to make fantasy and Norse myth-based fantasy more inclusive.
There's one question back there.
Thank you for your wonderful lecture. Are you personally, as a researcher, comfortable with the development?
Good question.
Yeah, I am, because I'm just fascinated by what other people do with these stories. And I don't really want to see, I mean, I would perhaps prefer to see my Wagner told as we were talking about the other night, a bit more straight sometimes. Maybe not have Yggdrasil turned to an oil well, which is what we had in Covent Garden last year. But I am really fascinated, and I just loved, I don't know how many people saw the Netflix Ragnarok, but I just loved that. I thought that was so clever. And in fact, I took part in a discussion panel with Joanne Harris and Genevieve Gornicek and a couple of other authors, which is going to be on YouTube quite soon. And we were all just talking about how clever the writing of Ragnarok is. Not just the tapeworm, which is kind of horrible, but weird at the same time, but all sorts of other really clever things going on.
Yeah. Maybe one last reflection or question.
Mm-hmm.
You sort of touched upon the far right and the interest in the Norse mythology. Now you have been looking at this issue for years and years. Have there been some changes in the way the far right relates to Norse mythology through the years?
I haven't done any real research into the far right because I do not want to go on those kinds of websites, really.
No, exactly.
Yeah, but I've read the work of people who have. And yeah, there's some shift in the far right, and in particular, and this is, I think, something that comes out of something I didn't have time to talk about, TV shows like Vikings, The Last Kingdom, where suddenly we have a lot of women warriors who are not Valkyries as in the Northman, but are fighting women who also have to contend with rape and pregnancy and childbirth and unfaithful husbands and substance, all the things modern women have to deal with. Well, it's the 10th century. And the far-right communities have begun to present themselves as less patriarchal and more as a space where women can unleash that inner warrior. And I think that, and with the Birka grave, 583, isn't it? And the discussion around whether women could be warriors in the archaeological record has given a kind of shift to that.
Very interesting. But I think actually we have to stop now. Thank you very much, Carolyne.